The golden fur along her arms stretched forward, seeking the heat of his bare hands. It was an involuntary biological betrayal, an instinct infinitely older than her regal title, breaking effortlessly through centuries of perfectly cultivated ice. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. That was the moment everything changed. But let me tell you how he got there. The marble table was cold beneath her fingers, kept deliberately cold by strict protocol. Matriarch Rathani sat at the exact geometric center of her private quarters. It was a room engineered for diplomatic intimidation rather than physical comfort. The vaulted ceilings trapped the chill, hoarding it high above sweeping obsidian floors that offered no reflection. For a Rathani, temperature was never merely a matter of environmental weather. It was the absolute physical manifestation of emotional connection. Her species' dense, golden fur was biologically designed to react to proximity. It would instinctively reach out toward nearby warmth, a subconscious search for pack and partner. When a Rathani's fur stretched toward a specific person, it meant bonding had begun at a cellular, irreversible level. Hers lay completely flat, pressed tight against her skin, an armor of absolute freezing isolation. It had been entirely flat for 900 days. 900 days. The number echoed endlessly in the cavernous dining hall. 900 cycles of the station's artificial sun since anyone had prepared a meal specifically for her. 900 days since she had been treated as a living, breathing creature rather than a calcified monument of the state. She was the matriarch. She was the immovable anchor of three-star systems, and she was quietly starving for something as simple as ambient body heat. At the far end of the impossibly long table sat a loaf of ceremonial bread. It was placed there every morning by automated protocol droids. It was baked according to ancient tradition, dusted with white flour, and presented on an immaculate silver platter. The crust was scored with the ancient crest of her lineage. Yet here, sitting on the cold marble, it was nothing more than a reminder of her isolation. Unshared, untouched, staling quietly in the sterile, heavily filtered air. It was a prop in a play with an audience of one. She shouldn't have been so intimately aware of the chill pressing against her spine, but extreme isolation sharpened every missing sensation. The absence of warmth became a physical pressure. It rested on her shoulders. It weighed down her breathing. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting flat against the freezing marble, waiting for a meal she would not taste. If you want to explore the quiet corners of the universe with us, join us. The stars are vast, but the stories are intimate. The heavy bronze doors glided open with a sharp metallic hiss. 3 high-ranking attendants entered the room in a synchronized, flawless procession. They wore robes of deep crimson, the fabric stiff with woven metallic threads that rustled like dry leaves as they moved. Their faces were painted in the traditional, stark white of the inner court, erasing any trace of individual identity. They were extensions of the station's protocols, not people. When they approached the dais, the air grew noticeably colder. They did not speak. They did not make eye contact. To look directly at the matriarch without an explicit invitation was a deeply punishable offense. They simply marched the length of the room, their boots clicking in perfect unison. They placed pre-packaged, nutritionally optimized ration blocks onto the table. The blocks were a dull gray, completely devoid of texture, designed solely for biological efficiency. A matriarch did not eat for pleasure. A matriarch consumed exactly enough calories to maintain the physical vessel of her unquestioned authority. Each block was engineered to provide exactly 2,000 calories, fortified with synthetic proteins, designed to keep her alive without providing a single moment of joy. The attendants bowed exactly 12 degrees. Then they pivoted and marched out, abandoning her to the crushing silence once again. She was a symbol. Symbols do not require warmth, and they certainly do not require company. Through the towering reinforced viewports, the distant harsh blue lights of the defensive perimeter shifted in silent, endless orbits. None of those millions of souls out there in the dark would ever dare approach her table. They worshipped her from light years away, leaving her to freeze in the center of her own palace. Beneath her station, the entire universe felt entirely beneath her station. The air recyclers hummed a monotonous, lifeless drone that only emphasized how overwhelmingly empty the massive quarters truly were. The attendants would return in exactly 30 minutes to clear the uneaten blocks. Their movements were entirely mechanical. They were rehearsed specifically to strip all intimacy from the act of nourishment. To them, she was merely an architectural feature of the room, a statue that occasionally required maintenance. Then the daily maintenance schedule cycled down to the lowest possible administrative tier. A human walked in. His name was Arthur, though absolutely no one on the orbital station knew or cared about that. He was 52 years old, possessing the thick, rounded shoulders of a man who had spent 3 decades hauling things considerably heavier than himself. He wore the gray, waterproof, heavily stained uniform of a level 4 dishwasher. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, bearing the unmistakable marks of endless, repetitive labor. He carried a battered gray plastic collection bin on one hip. The boots he wore were a size too large, causing a distinct, rhythmic squeak against the floor. His hands were large, knuckles swollen with mild arthritis, the skin scrubbed raw from industrial-grade sanitizers. He was the kind of human who existed entirely in the margins of the galaxy. He didn't build starships. He cleaned the grease off the floors of the people who did. Nobody noticed him. The heavily armed royal guards stationed at the marble pillars simply let their visual targeting filters blur him out, which meant the station's security grid categorized him as background machinery, no different than a sweeping drone or a ventilation fan. He began shuffling around the perimeter, clearing the discarded silver platters from the secondary tables. She noticed him. Specifically, the matriarch noticed the faint, curling wisps of steam rising from his soaked canvas apron. In a room devoid of life, he smelled loudly of boiling water, metallic scrubbers, and cheap synthetic lemon soap. To the matriarch, whose entire existence was filtered through scrubbed air in sterile environments, the smell was intoxicating. It was the scent of actual, messy, unscripted life. It cut through the sterile chill of the room like a physical blade. Suddenly, a harsh, discordant crash shattered the pristine silence. He fumbled a stack of heavy ceramic bowls. They clattered violently against the side of his plastic bin. The 2 royal guards instantly snapped to attention. They drew their kinetic rifles, their armor whirring with lethal intent as they aimed directly at the perceived threat. Arthur just blinked at them. He sighed, adjusting his grip on the plastic bin. "Gravity's a bit heavy today, lads. Keep your helmets on." The guards stared. They completely failed to process the casual, exhausted dismissal. Slowly, confused by the utter lack of terror, they lowered their weapons. Arthur went right back to stacking dishes. He was entirely invisible to the rigid hierarchy of the room. A dishwasher had no business noticing the empty tables of a matriarch, but he noticed. He shouldn't have been anywhere near the main dining dais. Strict protocol dictated that low-tier collection staff remain strictly at the service edges, hugging the walls like shadows, moving only when the room was empty. Yet Arthur shuffled closer. His worn rubber boots squeaked faintly, almost rhythmically, on the polished obsidian floor. He stopped directly beside her massive, ornate chair. Impossible to look away. The matriarch sat perfectly rigid. It was a predator's stillness, born of absolute shock. She watched him purely through her peripheral vision, waiting for the inevitable moment he realized exactly where he was. She waited for the trembling reverence, the dropped bin, the terrified, scrambling retreat. He didn't bow. He didn't retreat. He simply reached out for the untouched evening plate, sitting perilously close to her left hand. Neither moved. The bread was the only thing between his hand and her wrist. The distance was 4 inches. It felt like a continent. She could trace the map of scars and burns across the back of his hand. It was a hand that had worked, that had bled, that had mended. It was so entirely different from the pristine, untouched hands of her court. The ambient heat radiating from his bare, when working skin was a physical pressure against her chilled scales and tightly flattened fur. He paused. His thick, calloused fingers grazed the edge of the ceramic dish. He frowned, deep lines forming around his eyes. His thumb tapped the side of the ornate bowl. It was freezing cold. A subtle, immediate shift occurred in his posture. The careless, shuffling slouch vanished. It was replaced instantly by a quiet, focused irritation. The irritation wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the plate. Without asking permission, without signaling the heavily armed guards, Arthur picked up the matriarch's dinner. He turned his back on the most powerful, dangerous being in the sector. He exposed his unprotected spine to a matriarch who could have him executed with a single twitch of her hand. He walked casually over to the thermal plating of the abandoned serving cart by the far wall. He didn't punch in an access code. He just slapped the manual override, a brute force human solution to a highly sophisticated piece of alien technology. The heating element hummed to life, glowing a faint, angry orange. With a heavy sigh, he placed the cold ceramic bowl directly onto the element. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. He stood there. He casually wiped his hands on his apron, humming a tuneless, raspy rhythm under his breath. The silence in the room was no longer the dead, crushing silence of isolation. It was the taut, vibrating silence of a drawn bowstring. The guards were too utterly stunned by the flagrant breach of protocol to shoot him. The entire room was paralyzed. The matriarch's breathing slowed to a near halt. She watched the broad expanse of his gray back. She watched the way his shoulders shifted as he tapped his foot, waiting for the food to heat. When the ceramic finally began to steam, Arthur picked it back up with a thick cloth rag. He walked back to the dais. He placed the warm plate gently onto the marble table, sliding it deliberately closer to the ceremonial loaf of bread. "Soup's better when it's warm," he said. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait to be dismissed. He just grabbed his plastic bin and shuffled out through the heavy bronze doors. The space between them hummed. Will she let the warmth fade, or will everything change tomorrow? The heavy bronze doors sealed shut, their massive internal locking mechanisms engaging with a concussive thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The absolute, crushing isolation of the royal quarters was restored, but the center of the room was fundamentally altered. The ceramic bowl sat exactly where he had placed it, resting on the frozen marble right next to the untouched ceremonial bread. Steam curled upward from the heated broth in thick, lazy spirals, fighting against the heavily air-conditioned atmosphere. It was the only moving thing in the massive, cavernous chamber. She stared at it. Her breathing hitched. Even the silence knew. The matriarch did not reach out immediately. Decades of brutal, relentless conditioning held her spine completely rigid against the back of her towering chair. She simply sat there, paralyzed, analyzing the radiant thermal bloom pressing gently against her left side. It felt entirely alien. It felt incredibly dangerous. And the temperature of the room was strictly regulated at 54 degrees to ensure maximum biological efficiency. The bowl beside her was pushing 80. Then biology effortlessly overrode protocol. The dense, golden fur along her left forearm twitched. It was not a conscious movement, nor was it a trained reflex. The strands closest to the steaming ceramic bowl physically lifted from her chilled skin, standing entirely on end. They leaned. They stretched outward, blindly seeking the ambient warmth bleeding into the freezing air. A violent shudder ripped through her frame. It was a humiliating, undeniable biological imperative. Her body was utterly starving for heat, and the sudden, unapproved proximity of it shattered her composure entirely. The physical pain of thawing after 900 days of self-imposed ice was staggering. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the heavy crimson fabric of her robes sagging as the tension finally bled from her muscles. She closed her eyes, letting the faint, rising steam brush against the sensitive scales of her jawline. A sharp hiss. The locking mechanisms violently disengaged. The bronze doors slid apart for a second time, shattering the fragile stillness. The two royal guards stationed at the entrance instantly panicked, their kinetic rifles snapping up, armor whining as they prepared to obliterate the intruder. They had never seen someone interrupt the matriarch's isolation cycle twice in one evening. Arthur shuffled right back into the room. He completely ignored the weapons leveled at his chest. He was currently patting down the pockets of his soaked canvas apron, his thick, gray eyebrows pulled together in deep annoyance. He didn't realize he was walking into a holy sanctuary. He just knew he was currently falling behind his nightly schedule. "Left my rag," he muttered, which meant he had to walk back to the table. He moved with the heavy, ungraceful momentum of a man whose lower back hurt constantly. His boots squeaked terribly against the obsidian floor. The matriarch remained absolutely frozen, her eyes wide, watching him approach the dais once again. She hadn't expected him to return. Her arm was still resting near the bowl. Her fur was still actively, visibly reaching for the heat. He stopped beside her chair. He leaned over the polished marble, his large, scarred hand reaching past the ceramic dish to grab the damp gray cloth he had carelessly left near the ceremonial loaf of bread. The golden fur along her arm stretched forward, seeking the heat of his bare hands. It was an involuntary biological betrayal, an instinct infinitely older than her regal title, breaking effortlessly through centuries of perfectly cultivated ice. She stopped correcting herself. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. The ambient heat radiating directly from his knuckles was a physical weight, a gravitational pull that locked her completely in place. For a fraction of a second, his skin was barely a millimeter from her forearm. The temperature differential was staggering. She could feel the pulse of his blood beneath his skin. He paused. He looked down at the steaming bowl. He looked at her arm, though he clearly lacked the biological context to understand the immense significance of her raised fur. He didn't see a royal leader undergoing a profound cellular shift. He just saw a very still creature sitting alone in a freezing room. He picked up his cleaning rag. Didn't want the soup going cold. Simple, quiet, matter of fact. The words landed with the weight of collapsing stars. He wiped his hands on the rag, entirely unaware that he had just rewritten the molecular structure of her universe. He didn't offer a bow. He didn't offer a grand speech about service. He just turned around, tossed the rag into his plastic collection bin, and began the long walk back out of the room. And he didn't look back. The heavy doors sealed shut behind him, locking the silence back into place. It was already done. The matriarch looked down at her arm. Her fur remained entirely raised, standing rigid, still pointing toward the empty space where his hand had been moments before. When Rathani fur reaches toward a specific person, it is not a suggestion. It is a strict biological mandate. The cells immediately remember the specific thermal signature. Bonding begins at a profound, irreversible level. She could not order her body to forget the heat of his skin. She could not legislate away the sudden hollow ache of his absence. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she had not permitted herself in over a decade. She reached forward across the table. She bypassed the sterile, nutritionally optimized ration blocks. She bypassed the immaculate silver utensils. She curled her long fingers completely around the warm ceramic bowl. The heat seeped instantly into her palms. A ragged, shattered breath escaped her lungs, echoing loudly in the massive chamber. She closed her eyes and let the warmth travel up her arms, flooding her chilled chest, melting the ice that had calcified around her ribs for 900 days. She picked up the bowl, lifting it to her face, and finally, quietly, began to consume the meal. In the grand strategic theater of the quadrant, this simple act of consuming unauthorized, reheated food was a catastrophic security violation. The orbital station's monitoring sensors instantly detected the thermal anomaly. They registered the massive deviation in her rigid caloric intake routine. Automated alarms flashed silently in the deep security sublevels, prompting immediate, terrified inquiries from the highest levels of military command. Fleet Command asked why 3 cruisers had diverted to a kitchen. The admiral said, "Soup." They didn't understand. They couldn't. All they saw on their remote thermal imaging displays was a matriarch suddenly breaking a 900-day fast. They couldn't see the way she held the cheap ceramic bowl like a physical lifeline. They didn't see the tears that finally fell, silently tracking down her white-painted face, evaporating instantly against the heat of the broth. The next evening, the room appeared exactly the same. The vaulted ceilings trapped the heavy chill. The sweeping obsidian floors offered absolutely no reflection. The air recyclers hummed their monotonous, lifeless drone. But the center of the room was different. The matriarch sat perfectly still at the exact geometric center of the marble table. The automated protocol droids had already delivered the daily ceremonial loaf of bread, and they had placed it on its immaculate silver platter at the far edge of the table, exactly where tradition demanded it sit, untouched and ignored. It wasn't a choice anymore. She had moved the bread. It now sat directly next to her right hand, and it was no longer whole. She had physically broken the thick crust, snapping the ancient crest of her lineage precisely down the middle. Half of the loaf remained on the silver platter. The other half was pushed slightly forward across the marble, resting purposefully in the exact empty space where a plastic collection bin usually bumped against the table. She didn't touch her prepackaged ration blocks. She didn't look at the massive viewports. She just sat there, her hands resting near the broken bread, waiting. A faint squeak of wet rubber echoed in the corridor outside. Her golden fur immediately began to rise, reaching blindly toward the heavy bronze doors, long before the locking mechanisms even engaged. She felt the phantom heat of his scarred hands before he stepped into the room. A maintenance drone would later classify the fractured bread as meaningless organic debris. The station's security grid would log her elevated heart rate as a localized thermal error. The official diplomatic records would state that the matriarch remained in perfectly isolated, protocol-compliant stillness. The records were wrong. The room was still officially designated as cold, but she wasn't. Will she let the silence return, or will the heat finally spread?